Dr. Emily Watson, a historian specializing in early 20th century American family life, had attended countless estate auctions across New England. Yet the Blackwood collection immediately struck her as different. The auctioneer explained that the objects had been discovered sealed away in a hidden storage room of a Victorian mansion in Providence, Rhode Island, untouched for more than a century. When the auctioneer lifted Lot 47, a large ornate family portrait in a gilded frame, he announced in practiced rhythm, "Formal family photograph, circa 1903, professional studio quality, starting bid $50. Emily felt an irresistible pull and raised her paddle without hesitation, her eye caught by the sharpness and elegance of the composition. The image revealed a well-dressed family of 7, posed in traditional early 20th century formality, the parents seated firmly in the center, with their 5 children arranged around them. The father wore a dark suit that lent him an air of distinction, while the mother's elaborate gown shimmered with beadwork, characteristic of the period's wealthier classes. As the bidding advanced, Emily studied the faces more closely through her magnifying glass. 4 of the children mirrored the solemn expressions expected in studio portraits of that era, standing stiffly with folded hands and unblinking eyes fixed on the camera, just as their parents sat with dignified restraint that marked them as prosperous Americans of the Gilded Age. Yet the youngest child shattered the composure of the scene. Barely 4 or 5 years old, he beamed with a wide, delighted grin, a joy so spontaneous and out of place that it produced an eerie dissonance within the otherwise stern tableau. The contrast unsettled Emily, and though she had not planned to spend heavily, she pursued the bidding until she won at $180, trusting her instincts that this portrait carried a story worth uncovering. As she carefully wrapped it for transport, her attention caught a small brass nameplate affixed to the bottom of the frame. The Blackwood family, Providence, Rhode Island, October 1903. Later in her office at Brown University, Emily placed the photograph under the unforgiving lights of her research laboratory. There she began a meticulous examination, knowing that the boy's inexplicable grin was more than an odd detail. It was the first crack in a facade that would lead her into one of New England's most disturbing family mysteries. Using high-resolution digital scanning, Emily produced detailed enlargements that revealed subtle elements invisible to the casual observer. And what she uncovered made the little boy's grin even more unsettling. At first glance, the portrait seemed a flawless example of a 1903 studio session. An ornate Victorian chair placed with deliberate symmetry, heavy velvet drapery framing the scene, and carefully balanced lighting that reflected the considerable expense of a wealthy family determined to preserve its legacy. The photographer's technical mastery confirmed this was intended as a serious family document, not a casual likeness with each figure arranged in the standard hierarchical fashion of the era. James Blackwood, the patriarch, appeared in his mid-40s with the stern composure of a seasoned industrialist, his presence marked by the authority of a man who had succeeded in commerce and commanded respect. Beside him, Margaret Blackwood exuded the cultivated refinement expected of a matriarch from a prosperous merchant dynasty, her attire and posture signaling both privilege and restraint. Their 4 older children, 3 daughters and a son, ranging from perhaps 8 to 16, maintained the rigid solemnity expected of sitters in a professional studio. Yet under magnification, the youngest child transformed from a simple anomaly to a disquieting presence. His grin was not merely cheerful, but strangely knowing, a smile that suggested cunning and awareness beyond his years. His eyes, wide and sharp, carried an intelligence that seemed unnervingly advanced, as if he understood something concealed from both the photographer and any future viewer of the portrait. More chilling still were the subtleties Emily noticed in the family's arrangement. The older children's expressions, while outwardly composed, betrayed faint but unmistakable traces of fear or unease when examined closely. Margaret's gloved hands were clasped so tightly that her knuckles showed pale through the fabric. And James's jaw, though set in neutrality, bore the tension of a man suppressing strain. Against this atmosphere of controlled discomfort, the little boy alone appeared relaxed, his grin radiating a confidence or amusement at odds with the anxious rigidity surrounding him. This contrast left Emily with the disturbing impression that the child either remained blissfully ignorant of the unease that gripped his family, or understood it completely and delighted in the dissonance. Compelled to find answers, Emily turned to the Providence Historical Society's archives, where she discovered the Blackwoods had been among Rhode Island's most prominent families. Rising from the late 1800s textile and shipping industries, James Blackwood had secured a vast fortune through shrewd investments in both manufacturing and overseas trade, elevating his household into the ranks of Providence's most respected merchant dynasties. As Emily pressed deeper into the Blackwood papers, the smooth surface of the family legend began to fracture, revealing gaps and contradictions that hinted at a private life far messier than the public record. Birth entries for 4 of the 5 children progressed in a tidy sequence, yet the youngest child stood out at once. Little Thomas Blackwood's certificate fixed his birthday as March 15, 1898. Placing him at 5 years old in the 1903 portrait. But earlier household documents introduced a different. Thomas Blackwood described as a ward rather than a biological son, a child admitted under unusual circumstances who required special care and constant attention. Business letters from James Blackwood deepened the puzzle, noting the boy's special requirements and authorizing large payments to physicians, tutors, and discreet consultants. Some so high, they signaled ongoing specialized intervention, rather than ordinary pediatric concern. Most revealing was a letter from Margaret to her sister, dated August 1903, 2 months before the sitting, in which she confided that Thomas continued to present challenges, demanding vigilance, that James insisted on preserving a normal facade, and that the planned portrait would proceed despite her fear of what a careful eye might detect. The tone implied not a passing difficulty, but a persistent strain the parents struggled to manage out of sight. Emily asked herself what sort of nature required such orchestration, and why James would press to include the boy in a formal photograph if his presence risked exposure. To find an answer, she widened her search beyond society notices and probate ledgers to hospitals and legal files, tracing a trail of consultations that began in 1899 and led to specialists in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. The medical notes, couched in the evasive language of the era, sketched a child whose body developed normally, while his mind diverged in ways that baffled his examiners, producing behavioral and intellectual patterns that fell outside ordinary childhood. In 1901, Dr. Marcus Whitmore at Boston Children's Hospital observed that Thomas showed physical health, but displayed cognitive and emotional traits inconsistent with typical developmental pathways. His reasoning already outpacing his years, while his responses to social situations raised concern. A year later, Dr. Sarah Chen at New York Presbyterian recorded more details, stating that young Thomas exhibited remarkable intellectual precocity with powers of observation and analysis that would be notable in a child twice his age, a combination that cast the boy's bright grin in the portrait not as innocent mischief, but as something more deliberate and altogether more troubling. However, the doctors noted that Thomas's capacity for empathy appeared strikingly absent. He showed no visible distress when confronted with the pain of others, and more unsettling still, seemed to find amusement in the discomfort of those around him. To modern psychology, these reports would read as the early indicators of antisocial personality development, yet in 1903, the science of child psychology was so rudimentary that physicians struggled to frame their observations in meaningful terms. In letters exchanged between James Blackwood and Dr. Whitmore, Emily discovered discussions of how best to manage Thomas's troubling behavior. Whitmore advised constant vigilance, warning that the boy should be supervised to prevent harm to others. Yet he also urged that the Blackwoods preserve as much of a normal family environment as possible, in hopes that social immersion might temper his tendencies. This context cast the family portrait in a new and disturbing light. It was not merely a stiff formal likeness, but a carefully staged attempt to present unity at a time when the Blackwoods were quietly fighting to contain a child whose nature posed a very real threat. That radiant grin Emily had first found charming now seemed not only incongruous, but sinister, the expression of a child who grasped the tension around him with unnerving clarity and derived satisfaction from it. The true horror of the Blackwood family story emerged only when Emily uncovered long-sealed legal records at the Rhode Island State Archives. There, hidden among estate files and probate documents, she found evidence of the fate of young Thomas. In January 1904, scarcely 3 months after the portrait was taken, James Blackwood petitioned the Providence family court to have Thomas declared a ward of the state, citing dangerous behavioral tendencies that placed the entire household at risk. The petition included meticulous records of incidents that had plagued the family throughout 1903. Incidents so troubling that the court had ordered the files sealed for decades. The documents painted a chilling picture. Thomas had repeatedly tormented the family's pets, taking evident pleasure in inflicting pain. He had engaged in acts of mischief towards servants that could have caused serious injury. And most unsettling of all were the accounts involving his own siblings. In a closed session, Margaret Blackwood testified that she had once discovered Thomas smiling in quiet delight as he deliberately caused suffering to the family cat, and she recounted the alarming reports of household staff who feared for their safety. But it was the suggestion of targeted cruelty toward his brothers and sisters that revealed just how dangerous the youngest Blackwood child had become. The court records revealed that the older Blackwood children had grown increasingly reluctant to be left alone with their youngest brother. And several confided to their parents that Thomas seemed to delight in frightening them, even going so far as to threaten harm while smiling. Dr. Whitmore, called to testify as an expert witness, described Thomas as exhibiting traits consistent with what alienists of the time called moral insanity, an incapacity for genuine emotional bonds, coupled with a disturbing satisfaction in the suffering of others. He warned that without strict institutional care, such children often grew into adults capable of inflicting serious danger upon society. The court accepted his judgment, granting the Blackwoods' petition, and in February 1904, Thomas was committed to the Rhode Island State Hospital for nervous and mental disorders, with instructions that he remain confined until medical authorities deemed him safe. For Emily, this revelation reframed the October 1903 portrait entirely. It had been taken during the boy's final months in the family home, when plans for his institutionalization were already underway. His incongruous grin now read as the chilling expression of a child who understood the fear he inspired and savored it. Determined to know what had become of him, Emily pursued access to the hospital's archives. The sensitive nature of the records meant that permissions were tightly restricted, but her credentials as a scholar of family history eventually secured entry to Thomas Blackwood's institutional file. Inside, she found a meticulous record of evaluations, progress notes, and incident reports that traced the boy's troubled trajectory. Dr. Henry Morrison, the supervising physician, recorded in March 1904 that the patient continued to demonstrate advanced intellect, yet displayed no capacity for empathy. Morrison noted with unease that Thomas did not appear distressed by his separation from his family, but instead seemed to regard his confinement as an experiment, observing his surroundings with curiosity rather than fear or resentment. Staff documented his uncanny ability to manipulate both attendants and fellow patients through what they described as superficial charm, polite compliance, and apparent eagerness to please that thinly veiled his true intentions. Beneath this facade, Thomas provoked chaos with precision, orchestrating conflicts among other patients while maintaining an outward image of innocence. The accumulating reports grew darker. With time, the doctors began to recognize a troubling truth. None of their standard treatments, strict routines, moral instruction, or isolation were making the slightest impact on his condition. Instead, Thomas adapted, studied, and learned to exploit the hospital environment as if it were a new stage on which to perfect his unsettling talents. The hospital's evaluations grew progressively more chilling as Emily read through them. One report stated bluntly that Thomas appeared incapable of genuine remorse or emotional learning, noting he can mimic appropriate responses when it serves his purposes, but shows no evidence of actual psychological development or improvement. This ability to imitate normal behavior while lacking any authentic empathy stood out as one of the earliest systematic observations of what modern psychology would later define as psychopathy. Among the institutional files Emily uncovered, correspondence between Dr. Morrison and James Blackwood, revealing the continued financial arrangements for Thomas's care. The Blackwoods had met their obligations faithfully, but James had requested that all communication about his son's condition be directed through the family attorney, rather than to him or Margaret directly. In a 1905 letter, Morrison recorded that Mr. Blackwood has indicated that for the emotional well-being of his wife and remaining children, the family wishes to minimize direct contact with information about Thomas's institutional progress. Though professionally sympathetic, Morrison noted that this decision all but guaranteed Thomas would never reintegrate with his family. The institutional records extended into Thomas's adolescence, documenting a consistent pattern of manipulative charm, emotional hollowness, and deliberate provocation of others' traits that any modern clinician would immediately recognize as classic psychopathic indicators. Emily realized with dawning unease that she was examining one of the earliest recorded cases of childhood psychopathy preserved in American medical history. But her research did not stop there. Turning to society columns, correspondence, and business records, she reconstructed the fate of the Blackwoods in the years following Thomas's removal. The family's public face had shifted dramatically after 1903 to 1904, as if the portrait marked the end of one life and the beginning of another. Within a few years, all 4 older children had left Providence despite the family's wealth and prominence in Rhode Island industry. Maria, the eldest daughter, married well and settled in Boston in 1906. Her younger sisters were sent to finishing schools in New York and chose to remain on the East Coast after completing their studies. Even James Jr., the heir apparent to the family's textile and shipping empire, abandoned Providence in 1908 and moved west to California, effectively severing his ties to the family enterprise. For Margaret Blackwood, the ordeal took a devastating toll. Newspaper society pages reported extended rests for her health in the years after Thomas's commitment, followed by mentions of her as a semi-invalid who rarely appeared in public after 1905. James Blackwood, once a pillar of Providence's merchant aristocracy, gradually divested himself of his holdings, selling off his investments and relinquishing control of the family's once thriving enterprises. By the end of the decade, the family had retreated from the social stage, entirely resettling on a quiet estate in rural Connecticut, where they could live privately, far from the shadows of both their former prominence and the child whose presence had nearly unraveled them. The family's relocation to rural Connecticut seemed driven not only by a wish for privacy, but also by the urgent need to escape the relentless whispers and social scrutiny that had surrounded them after Thomas's sudden removal. Yet Emily's most profound discovery came from a private collection of letters exchanged between Margaret Blackwood and her sister between 1904 and 1910. A correspondence that laid bare the family's emotional struggle to rebuild their lives. In one 1905 letter, Margaret confessed, "We live now with the knowledge that evil can wear the face of innocence. I look back at that family portrait and see how blind we were to what Thomas truly was. His smile, which we took for childhood joy, was in truth the expression of something dark and calculating that we failed to recognize until it was nearly too late." Margaret wrote candidly of her nightmares, describing how images of her youngest son haunted her sleep, and of her gnawing fear that his presence might have left some indelible mark on her other children. "I watch my remaining children constantly for signs of Thomas's nature," she admitted, "though Dr. Whitmore assures me such conditions are not contagious. I cannot forget how he looked at his siblings, how he studied their fears and exploited them." The letters painted a vivid picture of a household that had lived in quiet terror during Thomas's final years at home, bracing daily for whatever unsettling behavior he might reveal. To place this history into a modern context, Emily consulted with Dr. Robert Chen, a contemporary child psychologist at Brown University. After reviewing the historical medical notes and court testimonies, Dr. Chen explained that Thomas Blackwood's case aligned almost perfectly with what is now diagnosed as childhood onset conduct disorder with pronounced psychopathic traits. The combination of intellectual precocity, emotional detachment, manipulative charm, and apparent pleasure in causing suffering marked a textbook pathway toward antisocial personality disorder. What made the case extraordinary, Dr. Chen emphasized, was the detail and consistency of the surviving documentation. At a time when child psychology was in its infancy and psychiatric terms were still crude, the physicians who observed Thomas had shown a remarkable acuity recording behaviors and patterns that would not be formally recognized until many decades later. For Emily, this realization confirmed that the unsettling grin captured in that 1903 portrait was more than a curiosity. It was the chilling mask of a child whose legacy would remain one of the earliest and most disturbing examples of psychopathy recorded in American history. The descriptions of Thomas's behavior aligned with what modern clinicians now recognize as textbook childhood psychopathy. The historical records Emily had unearthed provided evidence that anticipated current research findings. Children who exhibit these traits at so young an age seldom respond to treatment and almost inevitably develop into adults who present serious dangers to others. Dr. Chen observed that given the limited understanding and therapeutic tools of the early 1900s, the Blackwoods' decision to institutionalize their son had been not only prudent, but likely the only viable course of action. What made the case even more striking, however, was the family's early recognition of the severity of Thomas's condition. In an era when many parents even today would resist admitting that a child could harbor such chilling tendencies, the Blackwoods' willingness to take decisive and dramatic steps suggested they had witnessed behavior so unsettling that it shattered denial and forced them into action. Emily came to see the 1903 family portrait not as a quaint relic of Gilded Age domesticity, but as a carefully staged performance of normality, with one glaring exception. Every member of the family, from James's rigid composure to Margaret's tight-clasped hands to the older children's strained solemnity, struggled to maintain an image of dignity. Yet Thomas's wide grin pierced the veneer not as a mark of innocence, but as the only authentic emotion in the frame, the visible delight of a child reveling in the fear and tension he had created. After studying the magnified image, Dr. Chen concluded, That smile is the most genuine expression in the entire photograph. The rest of the family is hiding something. Thomas is enjoying himself precisely because he knows it. Emily's pursuit of the boy's later history led her through layers of institutional archives, legal petitions, and medical files. Her findings revealed the trajectory of one of New England's earliest documented cases of childhood psychopathy carried into adolescence. Thomas remained confined at the Rhode Island State Hospital until 1914, when he turned 16. The teenage records chronicled the same troubling behavioral patterns noted in his childhood. An absence of empathy, manipulative charm, and calculated cruelty, but now with a marked increase in sophistication. He no longer relied solely on childish mischief, but demonstrated a growing ability to exploit weaknesses in both staff and fellow patients, sharpening his skills in deception and control as he matured behind hospital walls. One evaluation from Thomas's adolescence recorded: patient has developed considerable skill at presenting himself as reformed and cooperative. However, staff members note that his apparent progress is superficial, and troubling incidents with other patients continue when he believes himself unobserved. At 16, he was transferred from the Rhode Island State Hospital to a specialized young adult facility in Massachusetts, where he remained for another 4 years. Yet Emily discovered that history and circumstance intervened. In 1918, as America funneled its resources into World War I, many state institutions faced severe shortages of funding and personnel. To cope, administrators released patients deemed manageable, even against medical advice. Thomas Blackwood was one of them. His discharge papers acknowledged that he continued to display antisocial tendencies, but justified his release by noting his ability to function in society without direct supervision, concluding that limited resources had to be reserved for more acute cases. From there, the trail grew fractured and ominous. Scattered municipal records suggested Thomas drifted through New England in the years that followed, never settling long enough to build ties. Police files from multiple towns recorded complaints, disturbances, and unsettling incidents linked either to a Thomas Blackwood or to a man who fit his description, though none led to formal charges. By the mid-1920s, as Thomas entered his late 20s, the paper trail nearly vanished. Emily found no death certificate, no marriage record, and no formal documentation of his fate. But what she did uncover chilled her a disturbing cluster of unsolved cases from the 1920s and 1930s involving missing children and unexplained deaths in towns where Thomas had briefly resided. While no direct evidence tied him to these tragedies, the pattern was stark enough to suggest that his release may have unleashed consequences far darker than his doctors had feared. For Emily, the case had grown beyond the bounds of family history. What began as the study of a portrait had expanded into the anatomy of a societal failure, a failure to recognize, contain, and understand a profoundly dangerous individual at a time when psychology lacked the tools to grapple with such disorders. As she assembled her research into a coherent narrative, medical consultations, family correspondence, legal petitions, hospital evaluations, the meaning of that 1903 photograph crystallized. It was not merely a family likeness preserved for posterity, but a silent testimony to a crisis unfolding in secret. The Blackwoods had posed with rigid dignity to maintain the illusion of stability, even as they prepared to consign their youngest child to an institution. And there, in the middle of it all, Thomas grinned, not in innocence, but in recognition. His smile captured the terror he inspired, the chaos he caused, and the truth his family struggled to conceal. It was, Emily realized, the most authentic expression in the entire image, a child's pleasure in the suffering of others, frozen forever in time. James Blackwood had insisted on commissioning the family portrait as a final act of preservation. a carefully crafted image meant to safeguard their social standing and provide a record of the family before Thomas's removal, rendered such scenes impossible. Yet what James intended as a defense against gossip, Thomas appeared to understand in full. His grin was not the naive smile of a child, oblivious to the tension around him, but the deliberate expression of someone who knew he had sown fear and unease within his own household and took pleasure in the fact. As Emily wrote in her conclusions, the portrait captured a moment of profound trauma. Disguised as conventional documentation, 6 figures straining to preserve dignity, while one child beamed with genuine delight precisely because he knew he was the cause of their distress. Emily's work culminated in a presentation at the American Historical Association's annual conference, where her findings were hailed as a valuable contribution to the study of how families in the early 20th century grappled with severe psychological disorders without the benefit of modern diagnoses or treatments. She also collaborated with the Providence Historical Society, ensuring that Thomas Blackwood's story became part of an educational exhibit on childhood psychopathy and the hidden realities behind seemingly ordinary photographs. The Blackwood portrait, properly contextualized, was transformed from an artifact of genteel family life into a case study of how visual evidence can reveal deeper truths when examined through rigorous research and historical perspective. The most poignant reflection came from Margaret Blackwood herself in a final letter to her sister in 1910. We learned that evil can indeed wear the face of childhood innocence, and that sometimes the most disturbing truth is hidden behind the most innocent smile. Thomas taught us that not all children are born with the capacity for love and empathy, and that recognizing this reality, however painful, is sometimes necessary to protect others from harm. These words crystallized the Blackwoods' ordeal and underscored the human cost of their experience. Emily's research ultimately revealed that the 1903 family portrait documented far more than a formal sitting. It preserved the moment when 2 parents and 4 children masked their anguish, knowing they were about to consign their youngest to an institution for the safety of all. Thomas's smile, immortalized in the photograph, was not joy at all, but the chilling satisfaction of a child born without empathy, one who had already learned to wield that absence as a weapon against those closest to him. In striving to maintain appearances, the Blackwoods had inadvertently created one of the most haunting historical documents of New England's past, the image of a family united in silence around the sinister truth embodied by the grin of a child incapable of love.